This is today's forum. I'm Bob Hadlow. I'm one of two, I guess, official or not official, unofficial historians at Trinity. Dale Voller is the other one. Dale will be speaking in a few weeks on the furnishings of Trinity. He has a real passion for researching the crosses and the candelabra and all the other things that the parts that are inside the building. So anyway, I'm kind of a setup for Dale, I guess you might say. But so my talk today is History 101, Trinity Architecture. So we'll run through a good part of Trinity history too, because the architecture is part of that. So we'll start out here with a photo from early part of the 20th century, and this will come up again later on in the talk, and I'll have a little more detail on it. But this is a photo, you all see it there, I hope, on the screen, of Trinity shortly after the building was completed in 1906. And it's interesting because you have all the telegraph lines and you had competing electrical companies in town, so each one had its own lines on the streets. They finally decided to each have its own part of the city years later. But anyway, you have a lot of clutter there. We talk about cell phone towers today. Well, we had other things going on 100 years ago. So let me kick this off. I have two monitors here, or two computers here, because I have my notes on this one, my own, and this is the Trinity one, and we can't do everything on the one when we're doing a Zoom call. It gets all garbled up. So I'll be advancing these separately.
Is this being recorded, by the way?
It is. So we start out with Trinity became a parish in 1851. A group of folks got together. We had a couple of Episcopal priests out here. One was St. Michael Fackler, who came out to Portland in 1847, just to get to come out west for his health, as people would say. You know, people always go somewhere for their health. And that's what he did. It wasn't authorized by the church, but a few years later, William Richmond came out he was invited by the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society of the Protestant Episcopal Church. And they sent him out west to Oregon country, to organize parishes. And he did three right off the bat in 1851. Trinity Church in Portland, St. John's in Milwaukee, and St. Paul's in Oregon City. And Trinity happened to be the first. So this is the first Episcopal church in the old Oregon country. Predates anything in Seattle. Seattle comes along a few years later, but this is the first Episcopal church in the old Oregon country, which was a big territory: Oregon, Washington, Northern Idaho, part of Montana. Anyway, so those two were out here and formed this church, and shortly thereafter, a rector came out. Or let me talk about Bishop Scott first. Bishop Scott and Evelyn Scott came out about that time from North Carolina. And he was the first bishop of what is now the Episcopal Diocese of Oregon. In those days, this was a missionary district. It wasn't a diocese, but he was the first bishop. There's some subtle differences. Probably some funding was part of it. There was probably some underwriting by the head of the main church on the East Coast to get things going here, to get churches going. Scott was sent out here to be the first bishop, and he came out across the Isthmus of Panama. They didn't go all the way around Cape Horn, South America. Of course, the canal wasn't built yet. That wouldn't open until 1914 or so. But it was a big trip to come out here, and they did it. And they set up. He had his first service in June of 1854. So what happened then, just to give you a little background, here's a photograph of Portland in 1852. This is Front Street, what we call Nato Parkway today. Now, we don't have any photographs of Southwest 2nd and Oak, what is Southwest 2nd and Oak today. That's the location where Trinity Church built its first house of worship. Here we have it. Here's that building. It's a early Carpenter Gothic church. It has, and what you characterize that is you have the Gothic architecture, the pointy windows. You have a decorated barge board along the end of the gable. And the roof is somewhat steep. Steep roofs were another part of what makes Gothic churches, Gothic revival churches. That's the makeup of them. Well, the first rector was John McCarty. He came out in 1853. And he was only here a short time, but he was the first rector and got folks going, this group of maybe 25 people, mostly men, to build a church. And Ben Stark, one of the early well-known people in Portland, gave Trinity Episcopal Church the land for their first building at Southwest 2nd and Oak. Later on, that became the site for the city police department. There's 2 different buildings, and the building there today was the last police department building before they moved to the Justice Center 30 years ago or so. But anyway, McCarty's interesting because he was a chaplain in the Mexican-American War, and he had a relationship with the soldiers at Fort Vancouver and was well respected. He wasn't here very long, and then went up north and founded churches north of here. He did work in the Seattle area and was a mover and shaker in getting St. Luke's in Vancouver set up. So here's a bird's eye view of Portland in 1870. And this gives us really the only real idea of what Trinity Church looked like where it was. So here's a blow up of that section. So with the circle there, we have that building that I showed you in the earlier slide. It has a steeple. And what we can figure is sometime in the 1860s, Trinity held a diocesan convention and they needed to expand the building, and they dressed it up a bit and put a flat topped tower at the front. I'm not sure what the other churches are around here, but we have the Methodist Church, a Roman Catholic Church, a Presbyterian Church. All the mainline Protestants and the Roman Catholics all built churches downtown in what was the older part of downtown, 3 or 4 blocks up from the river. That was it.
What year was that again?
This is 1870 in this drawing. Dale and I figured that, let's see, there was a diocesan convention of what we would call that today, probably about 1867. This was a missionary district, but it was a large missionary district. And from 1851 to the 1860s, the priests and the bishop were planting churches everywhere, up and down the Willamette Valley and up north. Well, Bishop Scott went back east to see relatives and went back across the Isthmus of Panama and caught the fever, probably malaria, and died in New York. He's buried in Trinity Church Cemetery. So Bishop Morris comes on the scene, and he's from Philadelphia, arrived in Portland in June 1869. And there again, they went across the Isthmus of Panama. Boy, that must have been a trip. They walked across. He's really known for doing several things, in particular, establishing St. Helens Hall in 1869 and Good Samaritan Hospital. Oh, something's happening here. Uh-oh. So he was also in Portland to lay the cornerstone for the Second Episcopal Church. The first church that Paris simply outgrew. It was a very small building that added on to. They were able to acquire land at Southwest 6th and Oak and build a new church. By then, Portland was growing by leaps and bounds. That was still a residential district. It was uptown. It wasn't down by the river. It wasn't prone to flooding. The first 3 or 4 blocks from the river routinely were flooded well before we built the seawall in the 1920s. So they wanted something more substantial. And by this time, Portland has grown and they have more architects. An architect named Burton designed the first church, and one of his competitors was Elwood Burton. His competitor was Absalom Halleck. He was another early architect, and they both made a mark on early Portland. By the 1870s, they have Albert Jordan and William Warren, and they're both really promoters of Carpenter Gothic architecture. And this is Albert Jordan's work. It's a church with a 150-foot tower, and it would seat 500 people. So it's really kind of the epitome of Carpenter Gothic. Very steep roof, well received. You can see that tower from anywhere in town. And Trinity was a big part of Portland. Trinity did work outside its walls. It had a role in the social network of Portland, helping people.
Bob, at that point, was there a cathedral in Portland at all? Or?
No, Trinity was no. There was no cathedral in the diocese at all. The Catholics may have had one by then downtown. There's an old building downtown which was the bishop's house. It's it's a restaurant. And the church is gone. They tore it down a long time ago. But there was a Catholic cathedral, but not an Episcopal cathedral. What's interesting is Jordan was set to design the rectory, which would be behind the church at Southwest 5th and Oak, in Gothic, Carpenter Gothic. He died. Or unfortunately, he died. And but we were lucky to have Warren Williams around. He designed the rectory, which is the building you see there in the center with the church on the left. And it really is more recent authorities on architecture in Portland see this as probably the best example of English Gothic revival architecture in a residential setting or residential type in Portland. And it does have the steep roofs, Gothic windows, the very decorative barge board along the fronts of the gables. And unfortunately, it's no longer here, neither is the church. But we were lucky enough to have two top Carpenter Gothic architects. The one example of Warren's work that we see today is the old church. So, and you look at that and you can see much of Trinity in that too, because that was the style, high style Carpenter Gothic with the tall spire, the board and batten siding. But it ends there, and I'll get back to that in just a moment. So here's one of just very few photographs we have of the interior of that second church. You'll notice it's hard to see, but there's a window back there behind the altar, and it's the Bishop Scott window that we have today on the east wall. It was the chancel window. It was behind the altar. The altar in this photograph is the altar in our chapel. The prie-dieu that's in the front there is the one that we have where our votive candles are, where people light the candles and say prayers. And the eagle lectern is there too. We're not sure if that altar came from was in the first church or not. We know for sure it was in the second church because the photograph was here. The photograph's in the late 1890s because we didn't receive the eagle lectern until 1897 as a memorial to Cicero Hunt Lewis, a major member of the church and benefactor. And the prie-dieu dates from about the same time. The pulpit is just outside of this photograph to the right. And we surely would love to have a photograph of the pulpit in the church, but we don't. And the organ would be to the left. You can see some of the pipes over there. This is probably Easter Sunday with all the flowers. Easter Sunday, maybe 1897.
Even then, we had a magnificent flower guild.
We did. We did, and we had a noted choir, mostly men and boys choir, but it was well known and very popular. Here's a good photograph looking north, Mount St. Helens, and that's probably Mount Adams to the right, Mount St. Helens to the left. There's Trinity Church, Southwest 6th and Oak. What's happening here in this photograph, it's starting to change. It's not residential anymore, primarily residential. It's becoming more commercial. And that location today is the plaza for Big Pink, for the lower portion of the bank court tower. And then across the street, kitty corner across the street is the old Wells Fargo building. And then down the street from that is the US Bank on the left-hand side of this photo. So we're seeing some push here for commercial in this area. Well, I'm going to break in here with Dr. Morrison for a moment. During that first period from 1851 until 1899, Trinity went through a rector about every other year. I'm not sure why, it's just the way it was, starting with McCarty and going from there. Morrison comes, here's Dr. Morrison right here in 1899, and he was here for 30 years. And he was a real force at Trinity, and we remember him in the Morrison room right here where we're talking today, and his portrait's here on my right. Well, within a few years of his coming to Portland, Trinity caught on fire. Had a plug flue for the furnace, and it was a slow burn, but it pretty much took up the roof on St. Patrick's Day 1902. We're lucky enough that some of those choir members, the kids were around here and were able to help notify folks of the fire and get some of the furnishings out, like the eagle lectern and some of the other things, items that might have burned up in the fire have been damaged by water. And pretty much everything that we have from the first two churches, we owe a lot of credit to those folks who were fast thinking and were able to cover up and protect some of the items that were in the church. It wasn't a total loss, but you know, the organ is gone because of water damage. The building could have been repaired, but you know, Trinity was bursting at the seams, and they were thinking about moving someplace else. They'd actually purchased some land over about what we call 18th and Washington, 18th and Burnside, and didn't build on it. But they were making their nest, so to speak. And this neighborhood was changing. It was not the residential neighborhood that had been in 1873. So we have Bishop Scott Academy. Bishop Scott Academy was at this location. Bishop Scott Academy goes back to 1878. I can't see all my notes on the bottom here. And
You can drag that bar up to the top.
I can. Oh, is it in your way too?
Yeah.
Okay. Get it up there. Get it out of there. Oh, great, great. Thank you. So Bishop Scott Academy dates from 1878, and it's kind of in a, it's kind of a, it was started out as a building a little smaller than this, and then they had a fire and they rebuilt it and added on to it. But it was Episcopal boys' school with military training, and it was this location. It was having some troubles though by the early part, you know, it was having some troubles by the early part of the 20th century when the second church burned in 1902. And due to some land negotiations, Trinity was able to buy a big portion of the land on which Bishop Scott Academy and Drillfield was on. So.
You're mute.
There we go.
You have to click on the thing.
Okay, there we go. So what happened then is Trinity decided Trinity to build a new church. So they found some land, and so what style would it be? Would it be another Carpenter Gothic church? No. Dr. Morrison put his foot down and said, no, not a wooden church again. We want a masonry building. He was very vocal about that. As it turns out, Cicero Hunt Lewis, one of the patrons of the church, and his wife, Clementine Cooch Lewis, had a son, David Chambers Lewis, who was an architect in Portland, and they commissioned David Chambers Lewis to design the third church, which is the 1906 portion of our campus today. In masonry, in Carpenter Gothic, or not in Carpenter Gothic, but in English Gothic revival, and that's what we have today. Well, where did English Gothic revival come from? It's a revival of English Gothic architecture that started in the 1740s, but really got in England, but really got going in the mid 19th century, due to large part to Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, who was a Roman Catholic in the British Isles, an architect who worked with the Catholic Church and designed some wonderful churches throughout the British Isles for the Catholic Church. This
And
example.
the Houses of Parliament.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, you're right. So here's St. Giles and Cheadle in Staffordshire. What's important about Pugin and English Gothic Revival church architecture is he was soup to nuts. Everything, the building, and it had to have the arrangement inside where you have a nave and a chancel. Spaces dedicated to certain functions. The windows, the carpets, the tapestries, the furnishings, everything. And that's it all had to be right. And unfortunately, he didn't live very long. And but there were others who were developing similar ideas at the same time. And here's another Englishman, Richard Upjohn, who came to the States. He was still an Anglican or Episcopalian, and he promoted English Gothic revival architecture in the United States. And the only one of his churches I've been in is the Cathedral in Buffalo, New York, and it's an early example, and it's great. But So we're seeing that, and you can see some Trinity in some of these photos here. You see some of the, you see Trinity in these photos. Our church is part of this movement. But we move forward a little bit farther. So Upjohn's really noted for 19th century churches. And then we have someone else. This is someone that Dale turned me on to. Ralph Adams Cram. Ralph Adams Cram was a prolific and influential American architect of collegiate and ecclesiastical buildings, and most often in the English and the French Gothic revival. The French Gothic, the real difference is they're a little taller and pointier, and they're more vertical than the English Gothic. But still, the movement got started in England, the English Gothic revival movement. And one example of collegiate Gothic that I can think of around here is Suzzallo Library. It's at University of Washington in Seattle, at least the older portions. The newer portions from the 1960s or something else, but that's classic. It's a cathedral of learning in a sense, and you have the reading room there. It looks like you're in the nave of a church, and they didn't build the tower, and fortunately that building's been seismically upgraded recently, so it won't fall down. A good example of English Gothic revival in Portland on the outside is First Pres from 1890. The reason I say that from the outside is it looks like an English Gothic revival church. Inside, it doesn't read Anglican at all, or Catholic. Pugin and Upjohn and others would say that's not quite right. It's a sanctuary. It's not a nave and a chancel. And it's just because the Presbyterians worship differently from how we worship. And that's the real difference. So it has high integrity, but it doesn't have the arrangement that one would expect in an English Gothic revival church.
Are those pews indeed curved?
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Yep. The last time I was there, I heard Lee Garrett give a recital on the organ. It was great. It was great. So Dr. Morrison in the vestry commissioned David Chambers Lewis as the architect for the Third Episcopal Church. He's the son of Clementine and Cicero Lewis. Cicero Lewis was a wholesale grocer in town, and he had a partnership with Lucius Allen. It was Allen and Lewis. They had buildings down on the waterfront, down about First and Flanders, actually behind the building where I work, right on the waterfront by the Burnside Bridge. And they were a biggie in wholesale grocery. And then Clementine Lewis was actually Clementine Cooch. She was one of Captain Cooch's daughters, and one of her sisters, Caroline, was Wilson. She was Caroline Wilson, Dr. Wilson's wife. The pulpit is in memory of Dr. Wilson, and of course Clementine Cooch is the lectern is in memory of her husband. And then the Glisson Suite, Elizabeth Glisson, the Glisson Suite. She was wife of Dr. Glisson, and Dr. Glisson. So that you have and then Mary Cooch never married and lived in Paris most of her life. So there were 4 Cooch daughters, and there were 13 Lewis kids. I can't remember if David was the youngest or not, but there was a lot of Lewises and a lot of Cooches around. Anyway, and Episcopalians, Trinity. So here we have just a drawing of the church in an early newspaper announcing that Trinity is going to build this wonderful church, and that David Lewis was the architect. So excavations began in January 1904, and Bishop Morris laid the cornerstone on June 17th, 1904. And why this is special, it's the 50th anniversary of Bishop Scott's first service in the Oregon country, which would have been June 17th, 1854. So we have a lot of anniversaries here, and they're intentional in celebrating them. You know, there were intentions there with the who was there at the cornerstone laying of the second church. So we're really lucky to have drawings of the current church. We found these in the files of another architect, Richard Sunderleaf, at the University of Oregon in his collection. The University of Oregon has a wonderful collection of architectural files for Oregon, all the big, drawings, photographs, what have you. And for some reason, he had them because he did some later renovation. He built this part of the building, the 1950s wing, and had drawings from the earlier architects. Anyway, we have this one. We have a series of these. This is an elevation shot of the east elevation. And what it shows is a wonderful tower without a spire, and they never did plan for a spire for this church, unlike the previous Trinity. We have a formal entrance there with a that projects out with a crenellated parapet on the top, and wonderful crosses. We had crosses at least at 3 of the gable ends. The main gable here on the east, and then the cross gable on the north and the south. I'm not sure about the west gable if there was one. And those 2 secondary crosses have fell off or fell apart, were never replaced. The cross that we have today, I think it's the 3rd generation. It's not the original one. There was an intermediate one in the 1950s, and then the current cross that we have today on the east gable end. Here's a cross section of the church. This is what's really interesting about this is we see the chapel doors on the right. There's a door on the left that isn't there anymore. That's about where the window is that goes out on the courtyard. During some renovations, that went away. It was a way to get out of the old sacristy. But then what's interesting about this photo or this drawing is that we can see the roof trusses. And what we have here are what we call vaulted parallel cord timber roof trusses. And they're really something else. I haven't seen any this elaborate. And of course, you see roof trusses pretty much in any building from this period. But ours are really something. And you can see these on some of the photographs we have on the website, where someone has really backlit everything. And one of the best photographs we have, I think. And I'll show it at the end of this program today. So here's the floor plan. What's interesting is we had 33 rows of pews at one time. We have 27 today. And it would seat 1,000 people. We could still seat 1,000 people with folding chairs. So we lost 3 rows of pews at the back, and 3 when the church put the narthex wall in 1966. Then we lost 3 rows in the front during the 1980s renovations. Because we pulled the chancel steps out into the nave of it to create that what we call the broad step. You know, where you go up about 3 steps, and there's a broad step, and go up 3 more to the chancel level. But the church is arranged here like Pugin would like to see it. We have a nave and a chancel. The chancel has choir pews that face each other. And you go up a few more steps to the altar with an altar rail, and that altar rail is the same rail that we have today. We were able to repurpose it during the renovations in the 1980s. And then we have a chapel off to the side, and it's a very symmetrical building in the form of a cross, very symmetrical. And on the upper part there, we have the organ chamber, and then a couple of a choir robing room, and then a clergy vestry. The staircase going upstairs that we have today didn't come about until the 1930s during some renovations. We have a great photograph here of James Barrett and his stonemasons. What we have is an unreinforced concrete building with a masonry veneer. It's a very straightforward building, and those walls are pretty thick. But we have horses here. Horses were horsepower, literally horsepower to build this wonderful place. And houses across the street over there where our parking lot is today. Dale and I are still researching what was over there, just to get a better idea of what the neighborhood was like in 1904 or 1905.
Can you say that again? An unreinforced concrete
building
with a masonry veneer.
So it doesn't have reinforcing bar like you would have in a bridge or a major structure today. That was just coming along. And reinforcing, when they did use it, was whatever they had. Old railroad rail, wire, the bar that our bars, we call it at work, is something that was coming around about that time. And then the question was whether it should be smooth or have the ribs on it so that it wouldn't slip around in the concrete, so that it would work together with the concrete. So they were just learning at that time. So this is an unreinforced building. Not to say that's good or bad. It's just it's a concrete building. It's Dr. Morrison wanted a fire resistant or fireproof building, and that's what he got.
Not earthquake proof, however.
No. And it's not the only one in Portland. So the big deal is in 1905, you have the debut, not the big debut, and we have several debuts here, but this new church has a new organ. The organ was greatly damaged. The old one was a Hook and Hastings organ in the old church. I know of a Hook and Hastings here in town, and there's one at All Saints in Woodstock. And it's not original to that church. They brought it in from the organ clearinghouse. but it's organ from that period. They were wonderful organs, but Trinity, the new Trinity needed a new organ because the old one was damaged beyond repair. And they got a new electro-pneumatic Kimball, which was state of the art at the time. And it was in the chest there, back behind where the officiant stands, or the cell where the officiant. And that room is still there. We use it for storage, all the Christmas decorations. So it was a big deal. And I found the playlist for it, and they were doing everything, including Vidor and some of the top composers at the time, along with along with Bach, Buxtehude, and everybody else. So it was something, but it was kind of but it was a way to show off the church. But the furnishings were new and old. They were able to bring furnishings over from the old second church. The stained glass windows, we found out at that time, were brought over from the second church. People asked me, well, did Povey Glass build those windows? And I said, no. Povey Glass was the big stained glass company here in town, the Povey brothers. But it didn't come around until the 1880s, and that church dates from the 1870s. But we suspect the Poveys probably had a hand in moving the windows from the second church to the third church. And you'll see those. You'll see those around. They're had diamond-shaped panes, and they're opaque with some ecclesiastical images painted on them. The one that's the most intact is when you go up the staircase up to the organ loft behind the chapel. Most people don't even know that staircase exists, but over there, over on by the chapel entrance, there's a staircase. Anyway, there's a window up there that was never changed out later on. But they were nice windows. Anyway, the real debut though was Bishop Morris's funeral. Now he laid the cornerstone, but then he died, and in 1906, and his funeral is really the showcase. And this is the first photograph we have of the interior. It was in the Oregonian, and there's a version of these available through the University of Oregon that gives you a pretty good reprint. It's more gray tone than black and white, so you can see the details. What's interesting is the eagle lectern is there. You'll see that the pipes are at least maybe fake pipes that are a grill over the organ. 3 windows, the altar that we have today, and the bishop's chair. The cathedral is back there in the corner, not where it is today, but it's there. We're not sure about the choir pews. Those probably came from the second church. But there's some stenciling on the wall behind the altar and comes down the side underneath the 3 windows. What's interesting is our sextons were repairing some plaster in the nave and ran across some stenciling. And it's probably campus sleeves. So let me get my other notes up to speed here. So an acanthus is associated with an enduring life and immortality and resurrection. So that's why you see it in churches. But it'd be fun to restore the stenciling at some point. I don't know if that'll ever happen, but at least we found some. We've been able to take some photographs of it, and maybe that's something we would consider. So the Oregonian had a good review here. On June 18th, 1906, after the occasion of Bishop Morris's funeral, the Oregonian reported that in the calm restfulness of a Sunday morning, whatever your creed, if you have not visited Trinity Church and seen the sunlight stream through the windows like a beneficent blessing cast its beams over the altar, organ, lectern, pulpit, white-robed choristers, and the congregation, you have missed one of the beautifully artistic sights in Portland. And if you've not visited Trinity and seen the sunlight stream through the windows like a beneficent blessing cast its beams over the altar, organ, during white-robed choristers, you have missed one of the beautifully artistic sights in Portland. Newspaper added, however, the interior furnishings of the church are plain yet dignified, but they are not yet complete, nor is the church beautified by ornate stained glass windows. The latter will come someday through the liberality of parishioners. And it does. So shortly after that, Bishop Scatting is consecrated the third bishop of Oregon. And here's a procession of choir members coming out through the courtyard. Probably came out that door that isn't there anymore from the choir vestry, and they walked around. Uh-oh. There we go. Okay. So here's that photo again. This is this photo that I was always wondering about. When did it come about? Who took this? When did someone take this photo? We know it's early in the history of the church. It wouldn't be 1900. I just threw that in there. When did this happen? Well, what's great is we have technology today that really helps us out. If I blow up this picture, this photograph, I can read the license plate on that car, and it says 1230, just a number. Well, Oregon had annual license plate renewals. You got a new plate every year. So the car may not be 1912, it actually is, but I can go to the DMV records online through Ancestry.com because the Oregon State Library had them scanned. And it turns out it's Clementine Cooch Lewis's Pierce Arrow automobile and from 1912. And we know the plates from 1912 and the car happens to be from 1912 too. And I know that because the license plate renewal for a couple of years later actually shows the more details on the car. So she only lived 2 or 3 blocks away, but it was probably a chauffeur, and she died a couple of years later. But it was a chauffeur-driven car. I suspect it was a Pierce Arrow limousine, and maybe she's going someplace after church. But it's great we can date the photograph because of the license plate on the car. And that's the technology we have today. And that's why it's fun doing research on these topics. Sometimes they're esoteric, but in any case, it's a lot of fun. So
maybe she made sure that the car was there for the picture.
Oh, yeah.
And Pierce Arrow was a good car.
the Pierce Arrow was like the standard, Cadillac's the standard of excellence. Well, Pierce Arrow was a lot higher standard of excellence. It was really something else. So that was a great car. So we had a rectory on campus here at one time. People say, where was it? Where was it? Well, the rectory was right here. We're just maybe over where the office suite is today. And it was between the church and what was an old drill hall that was here. You can see the edge of the drill hall before this wing with this wing and Kempton Hall wing were completed. And I call it it's a Gothic revival building with some craftsman elements. So you have those pointed arched windows on the top floor, and then you have some knee braces on the sides and a little wider roof section. But anyway, it's very nice. The church is covered in ivy, which we wouldn't like to see today because it does some things to mortar on the masonry. But anyway, the building was there and it looked out on the courtyard. Fast forward a bit, Bishop Scatting dies, and Benjamin Dagwell becomes the fifth bishop of Oregon. He came here in 1936. He was the third dean of St. John's Cathedral, St. John of the Wilderness in Denver. And he was the first bishop of Oregon consecrated in Oregon. All the previous bishops were consecrated somewhere else, usually in where they last lived. It was just the way it was in those days. The first bishop consecrated in Oregon was in 1929. It was Thomas Jenkins, and he became bishop of Nevada. And he happened to be from McMinnville, and they had it here because Trinity was a nice church, and it was easy for local clergy and others to participate. And we have some great photographs. We can do a whole talk on that from the Oregon Journal, a whole collection of photographs of everybody walking in the courtyard from the vestry, from the vesting rooms to the front of the church and the choirs. There are no photographs inside. They probably didn't allow photographs during the service inside, but anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked, except to say Dagwell was here for a long time as bishop, and he brought Lansing Kempton in to become the next rector. Morrison retired in 1929, and someone named Francis Ball came in for a short time, just kind of in between time. And then the plan was Dagwell wanted to hire Dr. Kempton to be the rector here at Trinity. And what he saw was he thought that Trinity needed a parish house to serve its flock 7 days a week. And he'd done as dean of the cathedral in Denver, he oversaw the construction of additional spaces there, including a great hall, which is now called Dagwell Hall. And there are a lot of similarities between Dagwell Hall and our great hall, which we call Kempton Hall. So, and I think we owe a lot of that to Bishop Dagwell. So Lansing Kempton comes in 1937 as the rector, and almost immediately, they start a capital campaign, and have a groundbreaking for their what they call the parish house. The parish house is this whole wing to the east of us. You have the office suite, which we call the Glisten suite today. That was the office suite for the parish, an apartment upstairs for Dr. Kempton, and then the great hall, and then a big kitchen, and upstairs a children's chapel. So, you know, here we have Bishop Bagwell there on the left looking on as Lansing Kempton overturns the first shovel of dirt. Here we have a photo later on. Frederick Andall was the architect for our parish house wing. Then he was an architect with what was used to be called Sutton and Whitley, and then it became Sutton, Whitley, and Andall. And you know, he designed a great space. I don't think many of you have been upstairs over Kempton Hall, but if you get up there, there are these big timbers that support the roof structure there, and each one was a tree in its own right at one time. And this is big timber, and then we have the wonderful masonry that complements the architecture of the 1906 wing. I guess here's a photograph from being up on the roof. This is probably when I was one of those days when I was junior ward and we were doing an inspection of the building with Buildings and Grounds Committee. And so this photo goes way back before we replaced the roof on the 1906 building, the slates. But what we can see here is, in addition to completing the parish house, the church constructed 2 guild rooms, which we call the Welcome Center today and Stearns Library. And then the portion behind that was where the old rectory was. There was a wall there. There's a bump in the floor as we were walking down the hallway. So anyway, and they also did, here's the children's chapel. Amy Gorham, marquetry with the altar and the other furnishings. Here's the Great Hall, which became Kempton Hall in 1966. The labyrinth dates from 1999. Here's the campus in 1947. Here you can see that old rectory sitting back there behind where the 1955 wing is, or 1956 wing is. I'm going to run through these fairly fast, but Chancel went through some renovations in the late 40s, new choir pews, getting ready for stained glass. The Bishop Scott window, like I said earlier, was saved. That's on the east wall. But the church commissioned Charles J. Connick and Associates Studios of Boston to create new windows for the church. And Connick studied the windows at Chartres Cathedral in France, and was really like the windows he saw there. And we have clear glass that's colored rather than art glass that's opaque. So he really pushed for clear glass that's colored with paintings on it. And so we have a wonderful collection of windows. We have 8 Beatitudes in the nave, with on the back windows, the front 2 windows. On the front window on each side is the resurrection and the ascension and the passion. The rose window is the passion and resurrection also. The narthex has two of his windows, the two sacraments, baptism and the Holy Eucharist, and then the chapel has its own set from the early 1950s. And Connick Studios was the go-to in the country, and we have a complete set, what I would say. So here's Charles Connick. They went out of business in the 1980s because they simply retired, and they were on Copley Square. Here's a photograph of the nave after those renovations and the installation of the windows. The walls were probably a color originally similar to what we have today, but they lightened them up. I believe because the windows darkened the space a bit. And they added some new lights. Here's the chapel. The chapel was extended in the early 1950s to make it a little bigger, where the altar is today, and to create more seating space. Another architect, this is Richard Sunderleaf, designed the office wing in 1956, where we are today. And I'm not sure what happened to the old rectory, it just went away. And so this completes the campus. Fred Baker designed the lights that are out by the door over here, and I suspect Fred Baker designed the lights in Kempton Hall and probably those tubular lights in the nave at one point. He was the go-to person for any major construction. He did the lighting in Temple Beth twice, actually. Worked with Herman Brookman, the architect for that building, and First National Bank, and pretty much any big building around here. He did his first commission was Pittock Mansion in 1912. So here's the nave in the 1980s. What we're seeing here, some changes. We have a freestanding altar, so the priests can face the congregation while they're celebrating Mass. The church became more Eucharistic oriented rather than having morning prayer every Sunday with maybe Eucharist once in a while. And the idea liturgically of the celebrant facing the congregation was something the church was interested in seeing done, and we could easily do it in this church. Some buildings it doesn't work so well. So we more formalized that with redoing the chancel floor and also installing a new organ. So here we have all the pews cleared out. They're doing a major work here. So we have the altar going in, at least the main portion of the altar, where it is today. And the Rosales organ goes in. It's a wonderful instrument, the backdrop for the most important space here in the building. And here we have a photograph of Trinity today. Here you can see those parallel cord trusses. Any questions?
Yes.
Hi, Jan.
Hey. If you go back to the photo with the rectory of the older building downtown, to the right of the rectory, there is a building that looks very similar to the original church.
It is the original church.
They did move it.
They moved it, yes. Yes, it was the Sunday school hall. And the drawings we have out on the hallway here by Waddingham is based on probably that photograph. They got rid of the steeple at some point. And moved it up 4 blocks, which was common in a lot of places. You move buildings around all over the place. They usually didn't have very big foundations. Yeah.
I want to ask about the exterior of the building. You commented about the cement. I understand that's called Columbia River basalt.
It is. It is. The basalt on the core of the walls are concrete.
Okay.
And then you have a masonry veneer on the
That's
outside,
right.
yeah, which is Columbia River basalt.
Yeah.
And it came from Rocky View Quarry,
Okay.
we suspect. The reason I say that is that when we added on to the chapel in the early 1950s, it needed some stone to match. And it was at the time when Meyer and Frank had acquired the old Portland Hotel and were knocking it down to be able to build a parking lot. And the contractor was able to get, and the stone for that building, the first 3 floors came from Rocky View Quarry also. So we were able to buy that and it matched. It was aged, it was weathered, and it was from the same quarry. So you'd have the same colors. So yeah, you're right. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.